You're slowing down progress with unnecessary concerns," my manager said flatly, sliding a termination letter across the desk like it was just another form. "We need people who prioritize deadlines." My name is Cal Bennett. I'm 58 years old, and I've spent the last 32 years working offshore rigs across the Gulf Coast, from Corpus Christi, Mobile Bay. For the past 3 years, I've served as Senior Safety Inspector for Maritech Drilling, stationed primarily on Rig Athena, 40 miles southeast of Galveston. I know the creak of healthy tension in a steel frame. I know the way heat shimmers differently when a pressure valve is about to blow. I know the difference between a minor oversight and a deadly shortcut. And most of all, I know when someone's hiding something. 2 weeks ago, I raised a red flag about the emergency shutdown system on the upper deck compressor. It wasn't responding to simulated triggers during our monthly drill. I filed the report, flagged it to ops, and emailed the district manager. The response: silence. This morning, I was flown back to land for a quick meeting. I sat across from Dean Lawson, the new regional project manager fresh out of Houston. Polished suit, spotless clipboard, and not a scratch on his boots. He never looked me in the eye when he let me go. As I stood, I kept my voice steady. "I'll gather my things." "They've already been boxed," he said, gesturing toward the door. "Security will escort you out." Security? After 3 decades of giving my sweat and back to this industry, treated like a threat for insisting on basic safety. I walked past familiar faces in the operations building. Some turned away. One younger tech, Mason, nodded at me, confused, concerned. I gave him a look. Not anger, not defeat. Just a silent warning. "Stay sharp. They'll come for you next." Back in the parking lot, I lifted the cardboard box into my truck. The air smelled of salt and metal. My hands gripped the wheel, but I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, heart steady, mind already scanning through next steps. They thought this would end with a signed paper and a security escort. They don't know me. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been pushed aside for doing the right thing, go ahead and like, subscribe, and share. We've got more to uncover. And this is just the beginning. My boots have walked more steel grating than most people have walked sidewalks. I've spent over 3 decades on offshore rigs, and in that time, I've learned to read the language of metal, pressure, and wind. I wasn't always a safety inspector. I started out as a roustabout, young, hungry, eager to prove I could carry my weight on the platform. Back then, every callus, every burn, every busted knuckle was a lesson. And I listened. My father, Eli Bennett, was a welder on land-based units in Louisiana. He had strong hands and a quiet code. If you're going to build something, make sure it holds. He never used fancy words, but his message stuck deeper than any training manual. Growing up, I didn't understand why he'd spend hours rechecking a job everyone else had signed off on. But years later, standing on high decks with waves crashing below, I realized it wasn't about pride. It was about responsibility. I carried his voice with me through every promotion, from floor hand to derrick man, from tool pusher to inspector. I didn't chase titles. I chased integrity. By the time I joined Maritech, I'd seen what happens when corners get cut. I'd seen scaffolding collapse because someone used substandard clamps. I'd watched crews pull double shifts without rest because management wanted just one more pipe run before sundown. I've seen men cry into their gloves when they thought no one was looking, after dragging the body of a friend onto a medevac chopper. That's why, when I spotted inconsistencies in the shutdown system on Rig Athena, I didn't keep quiet. I knew what silence can cost. Some say I'm too rigid, too old school. But I'll tell you what I am. I'm the guy who sleeps at night. I'm the guy who can look a mother in the eye if something ever goes wrong and say, I did everything I could. And if that's old school, then so be it. When I first joined Maritech Drilling, things felt different. The company still had grit in its bones, built by people who had worked the rigs themselves, who understood the weight of a safety line and the sound of a faulty valve. The founder, Richard Callan, was one of those men. I met him once during a surprise inspection. He shook my hand, looked me square in the eye, and said, "We don't gamble with lives here, Mr. Bennett." That stuck with me. But after Richard retired, and the board brought in his son, Troy Callan, everything shifted. The focus turned sharply toward efficiency metrics and quarterly charts. Safety budgets got trimmed. Procedures were streamlined. And somewhere along the way, the culture changed. Rig Athena became the flagship of their new high-output initiative. Bigger quotas, faster drill times, fewer delays tolerated. And with that came a steady rotation of fresh faces, consultants, managers, people who looked good on paper, but had never felt a vibration through steel or seen a man nearly lose a hand when pressure dropped wrong. That's when Dean Lawson arrived, all sharp suits and corporate speak. He was young, ambitious, and full of catchphrases. Forward momentum, adaptive thresholds, calculated risk. I watched as he cut safety drills down to 5 minutes, called our inspections optional redundancy, and moved critical systems reviews to the bottom of meeting agendas. I raised concerns early on, quietly, respectfully. I documented issues in my reports, sent emails, followed the chain. But Dean always had a reason why we needed to move faster, why a warning could wait. "You've got to learn when to push and when to let things ride," he said to me once, walking past the control panel I'd flagged. "This isn't your father's rig anymore." He was right. It wasn't. And that's exactly what worried me. I've always believed in paper trails, not because I'm paranoid, but because memory fades, documents don't. For every safety concern that got brushed off, I kept a record. Photos, internal reports, audio notes on my personal phone. Not because I wanted to trap anyone, but because I didn't trust silence. When Dean Lawson dismissed the failed shutdown test, I didn't argue. I noted the time, took screenshots of the diagnostic screen, emailed the district office. When no one responded, I backed up everything to a private drive. Some called it overkill. I called it preparation. I started noticing patterns. Maintenance tasks marked as completed when no one had performed them. Parts swapped out without traceable lot numbers. Pressure valves cleared without testing logs. I flagged them all, quietly, systematically, and I copied myself on every message I sent. One afternoon, I watched a junior engineer sign off on a critical cooling pump replacement. He hadn't even unboxed the part. I asked him later why he signed it. "Because Dean told me to," he said with a shrug. He said the vendor verified it already. I stared at him, not angry, just tired. He didn't even realize what he'd just confessed. That night, I stayed late in the maintenance control room, comparing serial numbers from shipment manifests to actual installed equipment. 2 didn't match. Both were lower-rated substitutes. The next morning, I brought the findings to Dean. Calm, professional, just the facts. He didn't even look at the printout. "I appreciate your attention to detail, Cal," he said smoothly. "But we're already behind schedule. The components are within tolerance, and I've cleared it with corporate." He reached for the printout and dropped it in the trash bin beside his desk. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't about oversight anymore. It was about covering tracks, and I wasn't going to be the next one to fall silent. It was a Tuesday morning when I found the last straw. The manifest said we were using grade 8.8 anchor bolts for the upper platform bracings, standard issue for high-load, high-stress zones. But when I inspected the crate delivered to the site, the markings didn't match. I checked twice, then a third time, pulling one out for verification. They were grade 4.6, half the tensile strength. In a controlled lab, maybe they'd hold. But out here, with salt, pressure, vibration, time. It was like trusting fishing line to hold up a crane. I photographed everything, compared specs, pulled up the original engineering requirements. There was no ambiguity. I walked into Dean's temporary office, bolt in hand, documentation tucked under my arm. These aren't what we ordered. They're under grade. They need to be pulled before installation goes any further. He looked up from his laptop briefly, glanced at the bolt like it was a coffee stirrer, and said, "The supplier confirmed they're within acceptable variance. We're not holding up steelwork over a technicality." I stood there, stunned. This isn't a technicality. It's structural integrity. You want to gamble with vertical load-bearing bolts on a platform 4 stories high? He sighed. "Cal, I've already cleared it with engineering. You're the only one raising alarms. Let it go." Let it go. That phrase landed heavier than the bolt in my palm. I'd seen what happened when men let it go. It was written in broken fingers, twisted metal, and the silence of names etched into plaques. I left his office without another word. Later that evening, I filed an official incident record under my name and emailed it to both corporate safety and my personal archive. I knew it wouldn't change anything immediately, but it mattered. 2 days later, I was summoned back to shore for a performance review. There was no review. Just a pre-written letter, a box with my name taped to it, and a man who never looked up from his tablet as he fired me. They handed me a cardboard box like it contained the sum of my worth. 3 decades of work, compressed into a single, silent square. Back in the truck, I sat for a long while with the engine off. Outside, the breeze carried the briny scent of the Gulf, and the rig lights blinked in the distance like stars that never moved. I could still hear the low thrum of machinery in my memory, feel the weight of my inspection clipboard against my hip. It all felt wrong. Not just the firing, but the way it was done. Cold, clean, like I'd never mattered. When I got home, the house was quiet. Maya, my wife, was still on her shift at the hospital. I placed the box on the kitchen table and opened it slowly. My old thermos, a worn-out field manual, a snapshot of me and Maya on our anniversary trip to Sedona. But something was missing. My tools. Not all of them, just the good ones. My Milwaukee drill, the precision calipers, my flame-rated voltage tester. Tools I'd collected over the years, some of them custom modified, all of them personally engraved. Gone. I called Maritech's HR department. A woman with a soft, uneasy voice picked up. When I asked about the missing equipment, there was a long pause. Then she said, "According to Mr. Lawson's report, you were dismissed for insubordination and contributing to a hostile work environment." I blinked. Hostile? "I'm just reading the file, Mr. Bennett. I'll follow up." I thanked her, then asked her to send the termination rationale in writing. And I made a list, every item missing, every serial number I could recall. Then I filed a theft report with the local police. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't swear or shout or punch a wall. But inside, something steady locked into place. I'd spent my life respecting the chain of command. But this wasn't discipline. It was deflection. And I wasn't done. I stared at the computer screen in my home office, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The folder labeled Athena Safety was already open, each subfolder time-stamped and neatly categorized. Faulty shutdown systems, underrated hardware, skipped inspections, altered maintenance logs, 72 documented violations, each one backed by photos, emails, or audio. Not guesses, not suspicions, proof. This wasn't about me losing a job anymore. It was about the people who would eventually live and work on that rig. It was about the young engineer who didn't know the bolts he signed off on were never meant to hold that kind of stress. It was about the night shift tech who might one day pull a lever in an emergency and get silence in return. I opened a new email, addressed it to the Houston Regional Office of OSHA. Subject line: Urgent. Multiple safety violations. Rig Athena. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. What I felt wasn't fear, it was clarity. I began attaching evidence. Images of the mislabeled bolts, inspection reports that contradicted internal memos, pressure test logs with timestamps that didn't match reality. I included audio from team meetings where concerns were dismissed outright. I labeled everything, made it easy to follow. Bulletproof. 4 hours passed. The room grew dark. I hadn't noticed the sun going down. When Maya came home, she found me still at the desk. She didn't ask what I was doing. She just placed her hands gently on my shoulders and looked at the screen. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked softly. I nodded. Somebody has to. They're going to fight back. I know. You might not work again, not in this industry. I took a slow breath. Then I'll build something else. But I won't stay silent. She leaned forward and kissed my temple. Then do it right. At 9:46 p.m., I hit send. And I didn't look back. The call came at 7:32 a.m. the next morning. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Cal?" Dean Lawson's voice was sharp, clipped, like a wire pulled too tight. I sipped my coffee before answering. "Good morning, Dean. I just got off the phone with OSHA. You filed a complaint, didn't you?" "I submitted documentation," I replied evenly. "Legitimate safety concerns. Nothing more. You were terminated for creating problems, and now you're proving us right. You're burning every bridge you have in this industry." He was trying to sound calm, but the edge in his voice gave him away. "Dean," I said, "if the site is up to code, you have nothing to worry about." He laughed once, short, bitter. "You know how this works. Compliance is subjective. What matters is perception. And right now, firms are calling, asking about you. You want to work again? You need to stop." I paused, letting that sink in. Is that why my tools didn't make it back to me? Another perception issue? A beat of silence. What tools? The ones I reported stolen. Milwaukee set calipers, custom testers. You know, the stuff that didn't make it into the box you had security hand me. Dean hesitated. Then, keep them. Call it severance. Just walk away from this OSHA nonsense before you hurt yourself. I already filed a police report, I said, my voice still calm. They'll follow up. I hung up before he could respond. Then I did what I should have done days earlier. Called 3 colleagues I trusted at other firms. Men I'd worked with on rigs from the Gulf to Alaska. The conversations were polite, but the message was clear. Word was out. I was labeled a problem. Companies were wary. Calls weren't being returned. By mid-afternoon, I'd tried 5 firms. Same result. The doors weren't just closing, they were bolting shut. And somewhere offshore, they were likely already scrubbing logs and swapping bolts. But I had documentation, and I wasn't the only one watching. At 4:11 p.m., my phone rang again, this time from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Darla Vance, legal counsel for Maritech Drilling," the voice announced crisply. "Mr. Bennett, I'm calling to inform you that any further communication from you regarding Rig Athena may be construed as defamatory, and we reserve the right to pursue legal action." I let the silence stretch for a moment. "Are you threatening to sue me for reporting safety violations to a federal agency?" I asked. "I'm stating that your recent actions, combined with the removal of proprietary documentation, may fall under theft of intellectual property, in addition to defamation." "I didn't remove anything," I said calmly. "Everything I submitted was documented using my personal devices and stored in personal accounts. No company servers accessed, no passwords bypassed, just facts. Facts your team chose to ignore." Her voice didn't waver. "Regardless, we're prepared to take steps if necessary. A formal cease and desist will be sent by mail." I ended the call without another word. The envelope arrived 3 days later. Inside, the cease and desist letter, and a printed copy of a non-disclosure agreement I had supposedly signed upon hiring. Except I hadn't. I remembered every page of that onboarding packet, and this one wasn't there. They were laying the groundwork to bury me. Not with evidence, but with intimidation. Try to make it look like I was bitter, vengeful, maybe even unstable. But intimidation only works on people who have something to hide. That night, Maya sat beside me at the kitchen table as I reviewed the packet. "They're not backing down," she said. "No," I replied, "because if this goes public, they lose more than a rig. They lose trust, contracts, investors." I opened a new folder on my desktop, named it Legal Prep. Then I emailed my contact at OSHA. "We need to talk again. There's more than safety violations going on here." And I meant every word. We met at a diner on the east side of town, far from the docks, far from the offices. He wore a ball cap low over his eyes and kept glancing toward the window like he was expecting someone to follow. "Probably a bad idea meeting like this," Raymond Tran said, sliding into the booth across from me. He'd been my lead electrician on Rig Athena for over 6 years. Trusted, quiet, sharp. "Probably," I replied, nodding. "But you came anyway." Ray leaned forward, voice low. "Because it's worse than you think. They're not just cutting corners, they're covering them up." I listened, quiet as he laid it out. After I was terminated, the crew had been working overtime, not to meet production targets, but to quietly fix the issues I'd flagged. The shutdown system was being re-inspected. New bolts were being shipped in. But the work was rushed, done in shadows, with no official documentation. They didn't want a paper trail, just a clean surface. Ray reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. "You remember those foundation welds that failed the early stress tests?" he asked. I nodded. They never retested, just forged the documentation. Same with the fire retardant panels on level 2. There's a memo from the supplier flagging defects. Management buried it. My stomach turned. Ray glanced around, then pushed the flash drive across the table. "I got it from Donna in procurement. She's been keeping backup copies, afraid this would all fall on her if something happened. After you got fired, she started pulling everything she could before it vanished from the system." I didn't reach for the drive. Not yet. I looked at him first. "Why are you risking this?" He shrugged. "My cousin's crew is supposed to rotate onto Athena next month. I'm not letting them walk into a trap." We sat in silence for a moment. Then I picked up the flash drive and tucked it into my jacket. They thought they'd cut me off. but they forgot something simple. You can't silence every man who cares. The files on the flash drive were worse than I imagined. Not just shortcuts, not just carelessness. This was orchestrated fraud. False test results, falsified signatures, altered material certificates. Dozens of pages showing systematic deception, stretching back months. It wasn't just Dean Lawson. It went higher. Procurement directors, engineering leads, maybe even the executive office. I drove straight to the public library, logged into a secure terminal, and began organizing the files. I cross-referenced the falsified reports with original source documents Donna had archived, internal memos, manufacturer alerts, inspection photos that had never been uploaded to the system. It was all there, a full picture. I forwarded everything to my OSHA contact, then sent a second copy to the State Building Inspection Office. That night, as I pulled into the driveway, Maya met me at the door with a look in her eyes. Half concern, half something else. I ran into Angela Morris at the hospital, she said. Angela's husband sat on the local zoning board. She mentioned something odd. Said Maritech had made large donations to several city officials right before Rig Athena was fast-tracked for approval. I nodded. It fit. Political cover, paper-thin approvals, rush contracts. It was no longer just about engineering standards. It was corruption, rooted deep. The next morning, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was steady, gruff. "This is Richard Callan," he said. "We need to talk." The founder of Maritech. I drove out to his home just north of Port Arthur. The man who'd built the company stood barefoot on a weathered porch, coffee mug in hand, eyes sharp despite his age. "I've been hearing things," he said. "When your name came up in that OSHA file, people started calling me. Old hands, inspectors, suppliers. You rattled more than a few cages." We sat by the water, and he told me what he knew. He still had access to internal accounts. He'd tracked unauthorized payments, backdated safety forms, and communications that proved this went far beyond Dean. "This was never what I built," he said, "and I won't let them tear it down in my name." For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. We had truth on our side, and now we had momentum. The conference room was all glass and silence. Sunlight cutting sharp lines across a polished oak table. I sat at the edge of the room, technically a guest, but very much a witness. Richard Callan had invited me here under the radar, under the pretense of reviewing old safety protocols. But we both knew why I was really in that room. Across from him sat the remaining Maritech executives, VP of Operations, Legal Counsel, Procurement Director, and Dean Lawson, his arms folded tight, jaw clenched. They hadn't seen me yet. I stayed in the shadowed corner, back straight, eyes forward. Richard stood slowly, his presence still commanding despite his age. "I started this company in '86 with a single rig and a promise," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably sharp. "That no man would ever go home in a box because we cut corners to save $1. No one spoke. Even Dean didn't interrupt. Richard continued, sliding a folder onto the table. "Inside that packet, you'll find documentation, some of it gathered by Cal Bennett, the rest by myself, proving falsification of safety records, fraudulent certifications, and unauthorized payments to public officials. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's systemic." Dean shifted, about to speak, but Richard raised a hand. "Don't. I gave you room to fix this. You chose to bury it." He turned to the others. "Maritech is facing federal scrutiny. Criminal charges are now likely. But we have one chance to own this, internally and publicly, before the government does it for us." The VP of Legal leaned forward, You're suggesting we self-report? I'm stating it plainly, Richard said. We clean house now, or the house gets condemned. Finally, his eyes met mine across the room. Cal, would you come forward? Every head turned. Dean's face went pale. I stepped into the light and placed my flash drive on the table. I didn't want any of this, I said quietly. But silence wasn't an option. And just like that, the room changed. This wasn't about one man anymore. It was about whether truth could still cut through power.